Hey, greetings everybody. Paige here, the One Foot Gamer, the only dungeon master out there with one leg with a YouTube channel, at least the only one I know about. Sorry for the gap in videos. Last week my good computer blew up. And while I keep an HP refurb, one of those $100 jobs, in stock at all times to get me moving again if something like that happens, I've only got my eBay business back up and running. It didn't have any of my video files on it. It wasn't really capable of video editing very well, so that shut down the video production for a little bit. But I got the new fire-breathing computer back in stock now and going. Well, it's half new. Half the old parts, half new parts. But anyway, I think today we're going to talk about something that used to be all over in the place in D&D, and that is wizard towers. Now, everybody knows wizards live in towers, and witches live in tiny old decrepit shacks out in the forest or swamp. Not really sure why, not sure if there's some sort of weird gender bias or what, but we'll just move past that. We're talking about wizard towers and wizard dungeons, not wizard shacks in the swamp. And oftentimes when I do these videos, I find myself looking to BECMI D&D, specifically to the Rules Cyclopedia, because not only does that put almost the entire game into one book, it also is the only version of the game that puts just about everything you'd ever want to do into core rules. You know, levels 1 to 36, mass combat, stronghold building, all sorts of other things that would be in different books and other systems are all in that same book. So that's why I tend to look at that book most often. And also, BECMI D&D was the most stronghold buildness version out of every version of the game. It expected you to build strongholds and towers and all that. So we're going to look to that version of the game for a little bit of inspiration as to what the rules say. But don't worry, we're going to go so far down the rabbit hole in this that we might as well end up coming out the other side in Draconia. Draconia is what I usually call the other side of my world in my D&D campaigns. You know, the place we never go. Now, why would you want a wizard tower in the first place? Well, why wouldn't you? If your character lives in an open world with consequences, then it's dangerous just to be a high-level wizard. Your high-level wizards can have enemies even if they've somehow never earned any. Some people are just going to be unhappy at the fact that that high-level wizard exists in the first place. You know, maybe there's another high-level wizard nearby and he doesn't like the idea that you're around. Maybe the king doesn't want any high-level wizards around. It could be anything. And in order to stay alive, a high-level wizard must either have a defensive place to live, and that's classically either going to be the wizard tower or the castle of a local domain ruler. Or alternately, they can continually travel so no one ever knows where they are. The BECMI rules mention that as well as an option. They can live anonymously, or they can live through a secret identity. You know, most people just think that they're Billy the rich man who doesn't adventure at all, and secretly he's the Wizard of Wazoo. Finally, they can also live as a hermit, far from civilization. Maybe indeed one of those shacks out in the swamp. Although the hermit situation doesn't jive well with adventuring, so we're going to ignore that. And some wizards, they might actually combine more than one of the above. See, they might live in that wizard tower or live in the king's castle under one identity and do all their adventuring under a different name entirely. That way, everybody they piss off is looking for somebody else completely different. All right, we're going to look a little bit at the text of the Rules Cyclopedia. Magic users who decide to live in their own strongholds, regardless of their political affiliations or interest in the outer world, are referred to as independent wizards. They are commonly referred to and addressed as wizard or maga, whatever their actual titles may be. Now, old versions of the game were really into level-based titles, although I don't really remember seeing maga used anywhere other than in this section of the rulebook and in the last 6 years or so on hats, and that's about it. Going on in the Rules Cyclopedia, an independent magic user may build or seize a tower. By tradition, he need not seek permission from the local ruler beforehand. If, however, the wizard does seek the ruler's permission, the ruler will probably give the magic user a lavish gift, official title to the domain, and possibly some sort of official rank and nobility to keep the favor of the character. Only the most powerful rulers would dare offend a magic user, whatever their alignment difference is. Now, I love this bit because it's very rare for the system to actually acknowledge the consequences of the powerful things running around within it. Not even the king dare piss off a 9th level wizard, because a 9th level wizard is capable of toppling the entire monarchy. Go look at my videos on what wizards of various levels can do. And remember, wizards are weapons of mass destruction. It's very difficult to defend against a wizard unless you know exactly where they are, what they're doing, where they're coming from, and so on. So the game not only acknowledges that not only is King Ralph not going to do anything if the evil Wizard of Wazoo builds a tower right in the middle of his lands, that if the Wizard of Wazoo asks him beforehand, he's probably going to bestow him with the title of Duke, give him the lands around the tower, probably send him a trained white hippogriff, a fancy ring, and a nice cake. Continuing along in the rulebook. After the magic user moves into his tower, he may choose to build a dungeon beneath it or near it. Most wizards and magas employ specialists to do their mining and engineering, but may decide to create the dungeons themselves if they know the proper spells. There is that word magas again. Not only do I think that some wizards would choose to build a dungeon, I'm going to think that would be the default, for reasons I'll get into in a minute. Of course, on the surface level, who wouldn't want to have their own dungeon? I've heard so many stories of adventuring groups taking over dungeons and using them as their basis, so why wouldn't the wizard want to have his own dungeon? And yes, high-level wizards can build dungeons entirely using spellcasting, although it takes so long to do and requires such a high-level wizard that it doesn't make any sense to do, because any wizard high enough level to create a fortress using spellcasting can also basically harness unlimited wealth and create it the old-fashioned way easier and not have to spend all his days for possibly years casting nothing but spells that move stone and do the like. Back to the rules. Of course, any character building a stronghold could also build a dungeon, a subterranean complex where prisoners can be kept and the characters can perform specific researches in secret. But a wizard can choose for his dungeon to be different. If once one or more levels of the dungeon are completed, the wizard leaves an unguarded opening into the dungeon, monsters will be attracted and will build lairs. Some wizards encourage this sort of thing, so they have ready access to a variety of different monster types, useful for research and staying aware of what's happening in the realms of monsters. Now, I would think any character type could build a dungeon and leave it open for monsters to come in, but for some reason it specifically says wizards only. The dungeon under or near the wizard's complex is going to serve multiple purposes. When the wizard leaves that open to populate with monsters, it becomes a source of income and spell components. Monsters move in, the wizards can kill off the one that brings lots of treasures. Adventurers will come and try to defeat the monsters. Some of those adventurers will unfortunately die, leaving their treasure and magical items behind. Now, remember, these adventurers were trespassing into the wizard's dungeon, not like they had permission. The dungeon also serves as a distraction for those who might come seeking to kill the wizard or steal his wealth. Once they arrive, they might decide to go after the dungeon instead. Or, for that fact, they can never be sure if the wizard actually lives in the dungeon or in the tower. Something we'll get into in more depth shortly. Back to the rules. Such monster-infested dungeons are not looked upon favorably by humans in the region. Dungeons tend to make the locals nervous, and the monsters in them often prey on nearby human communities. Wizards who create these dungeons need to be aware that low-level adventurers may take action against the monsters of these dungeons, either to keep the region safe or simply to fill their own coffers with the monster's treasure. Now, your smart wizard's going to defeat all that by making sure to set up his tower at least a full day from the nearest town. If nothing else, this keeps villagers from knocking on his door all day long, and that keeps monsters from being able to easily venture forth in the dungeon and mess around with the villagers. And that should minimize any ill will with the locals. Now, will adventurers show up wanting to loot the dungeon? Sure, they're going to show up. And a good aligned wizard's probably going to post a warning sign of the adventure stating that this is his property, they're entering at their own risks. And the good aligned wizard's probably going to avoid death traps, or maybe even any traps at all in the dungeon, just to make it a fair fight for the adventurer so he's not the one who killed them. Because if he puts a giant spike pit trap in the dungeon and some adventurers die there, the wizard's the one who killed them. If the troglodytes who moved in all on their own kill him, the wizard didn't kill him, the troglodytes did. Well, an evil wizard's likely to load the dungeon with traps. However, if he's smart, and most wizards are, he's going to carefully place them in order to snare adventurers, not monsters. Such as trapping rooms behind secret doors, or in areas of the dungeon that most monsters would not be able to access easily. Like perhaps there might be an underwater section. You've got to swim for 30 yards and come up, and then there'll be a trap past that. Your goblins and orcs aren't going to be swimming under that section to check that area out. All right, back to the rules. Independent wizards usually do not live in complete solitude. They may or may not interact with the rulers and nobles of the nations in which they live as they please. They may continue to go on quests and adventures with their old friends. Other wizards may visit and correspond with them in order to facilitate magical research and understanding. They might participate in the operation of schools of magic. And only the most misanthropic of wizards, or those with much to hide, build their towers in the most dangerous and inaccessible areas and live there alone. Now, I would mostly agree with that text above, although any wizard capable of casting Greater Teleport or a similar spell, teleporting without error of any kind, would likely best be served by placing his tower hundreds of miles from anything. There's no reason anybody needs to easily access that wizard's tower. Now, what would you actually expect from a wizard complex? Let's go ahead and create one for the wonderful Wizard of Woz. The Wizard of Woz is a neutrally aligned name level. I used to say name level a lot in the old day. It's always default 9th, but the Game Master could set it at a different level. And he's decided to build himself a tower and a dungeon complex. He wants to be on good terms with the king, but doesn't want to be at the king's beck and call, so he selects an area of land, a rather distant part of the kingdom, with his building site being in a mile-wide clearing in the middle of the forest, which he may or may not have created the clearing himself. The reason why he wants to be in a clearing is he wants to see anything coming for a very long distance. Our buddy Woz here, he sends a signed and sealed letter to the king seeking permission, and soon enough the king sends back a retinue of men carrying documentation and deed of title declaring Woz to be a duke and to own all the land within 15 miles of his build site, included with the men as an engineer and 10 stone workers whose salary is already paid for a year, as well as the gift of a rare two-headed albino cat. Now, Woz, being a bit paranoid, has already drawn up dungeon and tower plans with an engineer in a distant land with whom he identified himself as a totally different person. Woz will use the kingdom's engineer to help with building, but he's going to change his engineers on a monthly basis, only letting them see what they're working on that month to make sure that nobody knows the entire plans. What are Woz's plans? Well, they have a 60-foot tower, 4 stories tall, 2 outbuildings, that's a caretaker's house and a barn, and an obvious 3-level dungeon, and then there'll be a secret complex below the caretaker's house. The tower itself is going to consist of a reception hall on the first floor. Second floor will be barracks/rooms for the apprentices. There'll be a false wizard suite on the 3rd floor. Now, this false suite will be designed to look very fancy and well appointed, complete with treasure chests. However, it will have nothing of value in it, and the treasure chests will all be trapped. The wizard suite's going to have a one-way secret door that leads to a ladder going down to the 1st floor, where the wizard can exit via another one-way secret door on the opposite side of the main door, behind a hedge. And the spiral stairs in the wizard suite go all the way up to the ceiling where there's no obvious opening to the next floor. That's because there isn't any. The 4th and final floor of the tower is a trap. It's not actually connected to the tower in any way. The single window it has is large enough to easily climb into, though. And it's going to be full of traps or defenses of some kind. Locked and trapped chests, explosive ruins, etc. And it's got steel bars that are going to clamp down over that opening and seal the trespassers inside 2 minutes after they enter, and then an alarm is going to sound. That gives enough time for the entire group of trespassers to get inside before it seals. Now, for the dungeon complex, the wizard has decided to go with 2 entrances about 50 feet apart. One of the entrances is actually basically a false dungeon. It's got a tunnel leading to a circular loop corridor. The loop corridor includes a half-dozen locked false doors, and the entire false complex is blanketed in continual darkness spells. This can just simply slow down anyone coming after the wizard, or his dungeon for that matter, for some time. And there's a decent chance that some sort of monsters that don't need any sort of sight to operate could indeed decide to lair in that hallway. Now, the real entrance is a 50-foot straight corridor that leads to a large square hallway loop that is populated with rooms, but only on the outside of the loop. The doors in the real dungeon aren't locked or trapped unless the dungeon occupants add locks or traps themselves. And at the far end of the loop is the stairwell down to the next level. And the second and third levels, and any subsequent levels the wizard decides to build later, they're just going to be identical to the first level. The wizard specifically picked this very simple design in order to allow the dungeon to fill up with monsters as fast as possible and allow him to get to any room in the dungeon as fast as possible. And we'll get into why the outer loop is populated with only the outer loop is populated with rooms a little bit later. Oh, and one plan the wizard has to do after all the engineers is gone is he's going to put a whole bunch of statues in horrifying looking positions in the hallway leading up to that, in that entrance hallway, just to make people think that there might be some sort of thing inside that turns them to stone. But they'll actually just be statues. All right, the barn is just that. It's a barn. It's where animals, unimportant supplies are kept. Maybe that two-headed cat will be hanging around there if the wizard's not too into him. And this is where any prospective apprentices live while waiting for an apprentice spot to open up. Finally, let's talk about the caretaker's cottage. It's a simple stone cottage. This is the supposed home of the caretaker of the property. The cottage has a basement where supplies and wine are stored. In this basement, there's a secret door that leads to the wizard's actual home. The wizard's actual home is an underground complex of 3 or 4 rooms behind a heavily trapped maze. From inside the wizard's underground lair, the wizard can access his observation tunnels. See, the wizard has a series of tunnels ringing all 3 of the levels of his dungeon, with small, discrete observation ports allowing him to look into every single room in the dungeon. And these tunnels don't actually open up into the dungeon, so you'd have to knock over a wall inside the dungeon to actually get through. With these tunnels, the wizard always knows what is in his dungeon, and he can decide when and if he ever wants to go in there and retrieve anything from it. As for the caretaker, giving away the secret, the caretaker doesn't exist. When the caretaker appears, he's just the wizard in disguise. Now, this is just a very basic type of thing that a powerful wizard can do to sort of keep himself safe. Now, this is going to be buffed up with all sorts of spells and traps and protections, depending on how high level the wizard is going to be. But overall, the higher level he gets, the more difficult it's going to be to locate him. And not even his apprentices know about the real complex under the caretaker's building. All right, I think I've rambled on enough. If you made it this far, why not hit that like and subscribe button? That's why I'm really in this. And thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.